Good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome you back for this afternoon's portion of the program. My name is Trish Rodriguez-Terrell. I am with Religion News Service, one of the sponsors and partners in today's event. And I'm thrilled that you came, but we are more thrilled to be part of this conversation because if you can't tell the story of Texas without religion, for Religion News Service, we really cannot tell the story of religion without Texas. It just cannot be done. So we're happy to be here. For those of you who don't know, we are a 90-year-old nonprofit. We cover all the world's religions. So the issues that we're talking about here, we cover on a national scale. So I invite you, if you would like to know a little bit more about not just what's Texas, go to rns.org and you can read all of our content from Aleja and from Jack, who moderated the other panels, and from our other reporters and columnists, because I think this is the time for freedom of the press and freedom of religion to intersect, and we are going to be covering that every day for y'all. Thank you for coming again today. And now Matt's going to introduce the rest of the program.
Thank you so much, Trish. And welcome back to those who were here for lunch and to those joining us online. Our next panel in today's conversation looks at religion, migration, and belonging. Moderating the conversation is Rachel Schneider, Boniuk Institute's Religion and Public Life Center at Rice University. She'll be chatting with Crystal Silva McCormick, visiting assistant professor for evangelism and missions. And Director of Latinx Studies at Austin Presbysterian Theological Seminary. Rabbi Nancy Kasten, Chief Relationship Officer at Faith Commons. Erica M. Ramirez, Senior Director of Louisville Institute. And Aleja Hertzler-McCain, a reporter covering Latino faith and American Catholicism for Religion News Service. A reminder, we'll have 45 minutes of conversation, 15 minutes for your questions. You can submit them at any point during the program at texastribune.org/ask.
Okay, welcome everyone. Again, my name is Dr. Rachel Schneider. I direct the Religion and Public Life Center, which is part of the Boniuk Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance at Rice University. I know that's a mouthful, but I'm so grateful to be part of this gathering today. We've already had some really critical conversation this morning, and I expect that we're going to have extremely rich conversation today, particularly on this topic, religion, migration, and belonging. We spent a lot of time this morning really discussing the ways in which religion has been part of movements for exclusion to some degree, influencing attitudes and policies that very much impact the lives of others here in Texas. And so I'm really looking forward to hopefully in this afternoon session thinking more about lived religion in Texas, how what is happening in Texas today is impacting real people and real communities on the ground. We know that religious communities are often, when it comes to immigration and immigrant communities, are often the front lines of providing care and support and spaces of belonging. We also know that, religion is a key part of the fabric of immigrant communities in terms of, again, providing belonging and safety and a sense of connection. And so the picture is really complex and nuanced. And so I hope that we can really begin to unpack some of that today. So with that, I've asked each of the panelists to introduce themselves in just, a couple sentences about who they are and the type of work that they do so that you know what is informing the conversation we have. Go ahead.
Sure, I guess I'll start. I'm Aleja Hertzler-McCain, a national reporter at Religion News Service, where I cover Latino faith and U.S. Catholicism. I was in Texas in December for a 9-day reporting trip where I went to Austin, San Antonio, McAllen and Brownsville, and covered themes on immigration, but also Catholic higher education, so faith-based organizing, and movements to interact with poverty.
Hi, I'm Erica Ramirez, and I am a sociologist of religion who specializes in global Pentecostalisms. That means over the course of the last 4 years, I've been visiting Brazil, where I noticed early resonances between the way Pentecostals in Brazil related to Jair Bolsonaro, similar to the way Pentecostals in the US relate to Donald Trump. So using that comparative framework, I've been investigating similarities in their rhetoric and organizing style, and that I'll be proceeding from that most recent fieldwork when I comment today.
Hi, I'm Crystal Silva McCormick. I'm visiting assistant professor of evangelism and missions at Austin Seminary. I'm ordained in the United Church of Christ and have worked with immigrant advocacy. And I research Christian Zionism in Latinx, Latina communities, so Christians who support the modern state of Israel as center for their Christian faith, but specifically in Spanish-speaking Christian communities here in the US and in Latin America, which has a lot to do actually with immigrant communities in the US.
I'm Rabbi Nancy Kasten, Chief Relationship Officer for Faith Commons, which strives to lift up faith voices in the public square for the common good. Faith Commons is a fairly recently evolved organization started by my colleague and friend, Pastor George Mason, who is here in his spirit and it would be maybe online, I don't know. He was teaching a class today, but I'm wearing a button that I got in March when I was on a journey with Witness at the Border, traveling along the border for a week in Eagle Pass, El Paso, and Ajo, Arizona. And I wear this button and hope that this will take on meaning for many more people. The blue triangle was the triangle that migrants were forced to wear in Nazi concentration camps. And I have to say that the spirit of the migrant and the immigrant is very much part of the work that I do and of my own faith. I definitely feel like an immigrant in Texas. I was born in Massachusetts. I have never felt like a Texan. I've lived here for 35 years. Maybe all of what we heard earlier today can explain some of that. So I think that my personal story and my work that I do now are very much interrelated. And I began my career in part here at SMU, so it's nice to be back here as well.
So I want to ask all of you to reflect a little bit further on how your own personal identity or professional vantage point, but I know often those are so deeply entwined for many of us, how that shapes how you approach issues of migration and religion and belonging here in Texas. And so maybe we can begin with Erica, if you don't mind, and then we'll switch it up as we go along.
Sure. Well, one of the leading questions right now in conversations around American religious landscape is, why are Hispanic Protestants becoming more Christian nationalist, even as the alarm about Christian nationalism is being sounded? So I grew up in Protestant circles in South Texas, and this is no major miracle to me. I know them to be very independent and even contrarian thinkers. If I had to predict a group of people in the electorate who would take umbrage with having their religious preferences labeled, defined, or worse, chastised by any element of the American elite, I would have said my Texan Protestants. Texan Protestants are going to prove especially resilient under what they perceive to be any kind of class-based pressure or like regional-based outsider pressure. So that's informing my understanding of the challenges of the present when we try to understand how it is that not only Hispanic Protestants, but some of them very recent arrivals, some 0.5 arrivals, who have themselves been for instance, jailed. I wrote a chapter with a good friend of mine and the scholar named Lloyd Barba, and we traced how one recent arrival is both a pastor who was jailed for being an undocumented immigrant who said if he had the right to vote, he would vote for Donald Trump. And I think that those kinds of challenges where there's a kind of really uneasy way of trying to define this religious actor, according to the terms that we've already, for instance, set in this conversation, is some of the difficulty, I think, in trying to make sense of the religious narratives that are very operative in Texas, but trying to obtain legibility in a conversation that is mostly defined by scholarship that exogenous to Texas. So one of my challenges is then therefore to think in terms of just the movement itself. I understand Pentecostals. I understand global Pentecostalism. I understand its transnational networks. I understand why recent arrivals from Brazil who have been participating in Pentecostal networks will show up in Florida and vote the same way that a Hispanic Pentecostal in Texas will. And thinking globally, thinking transnationally, and making sure that those experiences stay relevant. A migrant doesn't just arrive tabula rasa, but has a trajectory. We see that, for instance, in the Florida Cuban and Venezuelan votes. So I think those are some of the you asked how my own personal shaping. Having had an ear for the way that Pentecostals have had a globalizing imagination since their beginnings in 1900, gives me a way of staying grounded in a different kind of reality there.
Crystal.
Yeah, thank you. So I come to the, I wouldn't even want to call it an issue of immigration because I'm a child of the border. I'm a Chicana, I'm a Tejana. I come and everything that I do, whether it's clergy work, immigration work with Palestine, I bring my grandmother with me who crossed the border in El Paso in the 1950s with her children, and some ended up in California. One of my uncles was a bracero. And not all my aunts and uncles learned English. And, my mom is 85, and she's an immigrant from Mexico. And I bring her and my family to all the work that I do. They are the reason that I am able to be here. And my grandmother had a second grade education. So I am grateful that I am in the privileged position that I am to do the work that I know that she did by feeding the poor when she hardly had anything. So I bring that with me, a passion for immigrants and for anybody on the margins, and that has been passed down to me. Yeah.
So we're about to start our festival of Passover Saturday night. I saw that I had 2 name tags out on the table, and I said, oh, that other Nancy Kasten is the one getting ready for Passover at my house right now. But this passage that we read at the beginning of the telling of the story of the Exodus from Egypt is one that I think really encapsulates my, the core of who I am. So I wanted to share this passage, which was written in Aramaic, no later than 1000 of the Common Era, so well before religion as established today, well before the establishment of nation states and boundaries in the way that we know them. Halach ma'anya. This is the poor man's bread that our father, excuse the gendered language. This is the poor man's bread that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. All who are bent with hunger, come and eat. All who are in dire straits, come share Passover with us. This year we are here, next year in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves, next year the liberated ones. And I think it's this religious, faith-based, theological, and all those words, we get those all mixed up. What's religion? What's faith? What's theology? What's spirit? So many differences. I'm not really sure how they're defined anymore, but certainly religion is one that is becoming more and more weaponized in a certain kind of way. But this expresses a lot of my identity, where I came from, and what I feel like I have to do in the world to welcome the stranger, even though I myself feel like a stranger. Doesn't matter, The only way to have belonging and have a place in the world is to be making a place for others at your table. And this idea of being in the land of Israel, again, at a time of diaspora. Israel at the time, nobody was thinking about Israel as a nation state as it exists today. The rabbis who wrote this text and the Jews who read this text for generations up until there was an actual land of Israel, which wasn't the thing that was imagined. It was something very conceptual. And reality is also always more complicated than concepts and ideology and mythology. And then the idea that this year we are slaves and next year we'll be the liberated ones again, that our liberation is dependent on our actions to liberate others. So in my life, in my work with Faith Commons, I feel very blessed to be part of an organization where I can live out that identity in a way, in conversation with people who come from other backgrounds and other faith traditions, and to learn from that.
Sure. So I come at all of this from a national reporter's perspective, covering all of these issues, but really seeing in multiple ways, like our panel on Christian nationalism said, that so many things that we're seeing on the national stage are starting in Texas. And that goes further than some things that kind of maybe intersect with Christian nationalism. So I'll start with that, though. One kind of trend that I've been tracking is the kind of demonization of faith-based work on migration. And back in 2021, Representative Lance Gooden, who actually represents part of Dallas, started saying that nonprofits at the border were engaging in nefarious work, that there was something, that they were facilitating illegal immigration or encouraging it. And that grew to a specific focus on Catholic charities. And with all of that, these accusations, which then spread to other right-wing influencers, to other Republican politicians, and then even some fringe Catholic groups, all of them are fairly nebulous accusations. They don't tend to have a lot of evidence, but they often really center on this idea of facilitating illegal immigration. Sometimes human trafficking gets mentioned, or even child smuggling. There's all sorts of kind of threads there. But that, went national, right? That ended up in Congress. That ended up really escalating in Texas to the point that there was kind of an investigation into a Catholic nonprofit at the border, Annunciation House, but also that Catholic charities across the country, Jack Jenkins and I reported last year, started receiving threats. But now that the second Trump administration has begun, that kind of strategy is happening at the national level, where we're seeing echoes of Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton's investigations now, as FEMA's sending out letters to nonprofits that have received funding, asking whether they've been involved in human smuggling, or kind of making those accusations. So that's one way that we see something that started in Texas happening nationally. And it was good that we were paying attention to this stuff going on at Annunciation House. I think that was last year that it started, because it became really extremely relevant nationally. But even beyond that, there's a long history of other things going on in the faith space that end up impacting the national level. So one story I did from my December trip was about faith-based organizing out of San Antonio, a group called COPS Metro, which is an affiliate of the Industrial Areas Foundation. They organize through local institutions, but particularly congregations, particularly Catholic churches. And about 50 years ago, they pioneered a method of faith-based organizing that is now pretty mainstream across the country. And you see it lots of places. And one kind of thread of that model of faith-based organizing and opposition to some of the ways the Trump administration the first time around was targeting immigrants came out of Dallas's Industrial Areas Foundation affiliate. And so they pioneered something called congregational IDs, which were getting kind of handed out to community members, and through agreements with law enforcement, They were making sure that community members would feel more comfortable interacting with law enforcement, more comfortable leaving their homes to attend mass, to attend other religious services. So hopefully people wouldn't be so afraid. And I don't think that's necessarily a strategy that's going to work this kind of second Trump administration, but there are these strategies that come out of Texas that you end up seeing in Baltimore, that you end up seeing in the rest of the country. And I could talk about a million other examples of things that come out of Texas, but I need to cut myself off at some point.
Thanks. Well, you've already begun to answer the next question, and maybe we can start with Nancy on this one. So how do you see movement and migration shaping religion here in Texas, or how do you see religion in Texas impacting issues of movement and migration?
You know, when we were looking at all the charts and the religious makeup of Texas, I don't really think that tells the whole story, because I think within each of those groups, whether they're evangelical Christians or non-evangelical Christians or non-Christians or unaffiliated, there are the people who embrace and accept and see migration and making Texas an inclusive, diverse, welcoming place for everybody as part of their faith, whether they affiliate with a religion or not. Faith is about having faith in something. We can have faith in humanity. We can have faith in elected officials if they deserve it, right? It struck me that when, that the evangelical Christians are more likely to be Christian nationalists, and they are the ones who are going to church and listening to their pastors in large numbers. Pastors in those communities have a huge impact, but mainstream Christians and peoples of other faiths aren't necessarily going into those large congregations and hearing the word from their pastors. And I think the other issue is that in non-fundamentalist religious spaces, there's a mandate, not just a need and a desire, but a mandate to, not just afflict the comfortable, to also comfort the afflicted. And you don't want to turn congregations. Most people don't want to turn congregations into Democratic congregations and Republican congregations. And so the inclusive religious voices, and I think this applies to journalism too, right? The inclusive voices of anyone are being silenced in the interest of being inclusive. Right? We don't want to be divisive. We want to be welcoming to everyone, no matter what their beliefs are. But that is at the expense of creating the kind of environment that we want to see here in Texas. And I think that's a story that needs to be highlighted in whatever ways we can, in whatever spaces we are existing in. And let me also say that Faith Commons, George started Faith Commons with an interview show called Good God, where he interviewed people who were business people and athletes and professors and elected officials about the faith values that led them to do what they did and informed their work. And we are all people of faith. It's not just up to the religious communities to do this work. We have to be giving people that voice in every sector of our community and our society.
Crystal, how about you? How do you see migration shaping religion in Texas, or also how is religion in Texas shaping how you think about issues of movement and migration?
Yeah, thank you. So from a faith perspective, I think first and foremost that I think the stories that need to be focused on are the stories of the migrants and their religion and their religiosity and their spirituality, which is diverse and which is very strong, and their commitments to their faith are so strong. And what is horrifying is for decades they've come to the border and they've been met with religious people's voices who have said, we don't want you here. And I want to say that I want to be very critical of the evangelicals and the mainline Christians actually in Texas who deserve a share of the blame for where we are now, because instead of being consistent with our values around immigration, regardless of who is in power, be it Democrat, Republican, or anything in between, we have made allowances for candidates and politicians that we align with or that we appreciate for one reason or another. And they actually need to be beholden to the church and to religious communities who need to be consistent with their values. And so detention centers have been around for decades. I was at the White House protesting, even though there were things that I was excited about with President Obama and things, but I'm going to be honest, I was at the White House with clergy. And we were there to protest because he was deporting people in mass numbers. And there were immigrants there in tears, afraid that they were going to be deported and had already had family deported. And so when we make allowances for detention centers, which are actually internment camps where people have been raped and fed food with maggots for decades now, and have also had hunger strikes, when we allow this for decades, we cannot be surprised that it is an escalation of where it is now. And so it is a mandate, I think, for all of us to respond to the religiosity, to the faith, to the courage of immigrants, their stories, their experiences, by us having courage to speak the truth, no matter who is in power, against these human rights abuses, which are now being escalated in ways that we can't get our head around and that are beyond heartbreaking.
What's your take on this, Erica?
So first off just get to thinking with my co-panelists. It's always hard to recenter. Thank you. So at present, the global estimate of Pentecostals is numbered at somewhere between 500 and 600 million. And the story of the origins of a Pentecostalism have commonly been told as a movement, a revival that started in 1906 in Los Angeles. But I know of a really exciting new book coming out in Baylor University Press by a professor, Gordon Melton, who will point out that actually the Los Angeles mission that spurred on this revival from like 15 people to now almost 600 million started in Houston. And he's also arguing, his manuscript is already in, that there have always been more charismatic / Pentecostals, so that's a kind of, I'll just leave it there and hope you understand, that there have always been more of them in Texas than anywhere else. So he's contending for the Texan seat and roots of Pentecostalism. I'm really looking forward to this work. And in that way, I think one of my answers is, we're already looking at how Texan religion has shaped American public life, Brazilian public life, but let me give you an ear for what I heard when I was last in Brazil. Actually, 2 times ago, I was visiting Brasilia, the capital, and I got to sit down with many of their senators, and one senator in particular is representative of their evangelical / Pentecostal cohort. And he told me to come back and tell the American evangelicals that they're all counting on them to vote for Trump. And that gave me an ear for how charismatic and Pentecostals globally see each other. They have an understanding of their role in shaping their respective national politics, and they see themselves, it's an emerging consciousness, as in league with each other. So they'll say the troubles that Jair Bolsonaro are facing, and he also had, that was a president who also had an insurrection in his favor, mostly spearheaded by Pentecostals, and has recently been disbarred from running for office again or disallowed. They'll say those troubles are the same as Donald Trump has had. And actually Donald Trump just said the troubles that Marine Le Pen and Jair Bolsonaro are having are the same as I have had with the lawfare in this nation. So I think in conclusion to that short vignette, what I'll say is that there is already an international network of charismatic and Pentecostals shaping Texas politics, but they have already an international consciousness about their numbers, their work, their influence in geopolitics. I'll leave it there because I could go further, but I want to give, that's how I see Texan religion as this really strong node in international religious networks.
Well, I really appreciate that. Just to kind of add to what you just said, I think, we talked a lot about kind of this dominion theology in the earlier panels, and so often that has been seen and sort of primarily connected with whiteness and white Christianity, but it is far more complex and nuanced than that, and that's how we can begin to make sense of, Christian nationalism across the global South, and how that, even when we think about African immigrants and other kinds of immigrants to the United States, that's intersecting in some really nuanced ways that we have a large communities who are coming, from countries, throughout, who may have their theology and their politics intersect in ways that are not fully being accounted for, and their own interests as well. So I appreciate that. Aleja, how do you think about the connection between religion in Texas and migration and movement?
Yeah, there's so many ways we could go there, and Crystal mentioned that definitely religious people are part of the pushback to migrants arriving, but also in my reporting in the Rio Grande Valley, I really saw the way migration and movement is just part of the daily life of congregations at the border. I visited a Southern Baptist convention church that before Trump came into office and pretty much blocked asylum cases from happening, they were welcoming asylum seekers who had been just released from federal custody to their church almost nightly. And those migrants would be part of worship services. It was a pretty explicit evangelistic kind of effort, but as part of their nightly worship, before just a few months ago, they would be welcoming those migrants, they would be introducing them. And when I was there, the pastor said, you are all our VIP guests, you're the most important people in the room, except for Jesus, of course. So that, it's part of that kind of daily rhythm. There's another ministry I went and visited called Border Missions that serves people experiencing food insecurity on Thursdays, and they'll have a hot meal, a worship service, and then send people home with groceries. And the vast majority of people attending there who really see that as their church, that's how they identify it, are crossing the border from Reynosa, Mexico. So in that region, there's just so much. People just move back and forth. It's part of what they've done for a long time. And it's part of kind of the daily rhythms of a lot of congregations. And then I think another way that we're seeing religion impact migration as we're having these attacks on religious work with migrants, we're seeing religious people also, take public stands and say this is a big and important part of my faith, our faith, and do that publicly. And specifically, we're seeing a religious liberty argument kind of come out to the forefront. I've been trying to do reporting to track down exactly how it started. Working theory based on what I have publicly is that after Annunciation House, the investigation started last February. We saw the chairman of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Religious Liberty actually take a stand publicly within weeks and say this is a religious liberty issue. He didn't specifically mention Annunciation House, but he directed it to the bishops in Texas and said, our ability to work with migrants is an expression of our faith and is a religious liberty issue. And since then, you've heard all sorts of religious people working with migration, especially in Catholic spaces, but it's spreading beyond that now, kind of framing this as a religious liberty issue, talking about it that way. And it will be interesting to see if that ends up in court eventually. I don't know.
Rachel, can I just say one other thing? I think we also should think about the domestic migration that's happening in and out of Texas. Who's coming in and who's leaving. And and also the economic implications of our politics and not our politics, but our policies. So when I was at the border, I had been in El Paso a year ago. I saw how much more militarized it was a year later. Certainly Eagle Pass is the perfect example. I mean, just continuing to militarize that border, even though there's really nothing happening there. And in the meantime, the economy on both sides of the border is dying, right? The restaurants are closing, the shops are closing, people are not out doing anything. Even if they're not migrants, they're not there. So, people are coming to Texas for for lower taxes and, to be able to afford certain kinds of things that they want to afford. But we're also getting a brain drain and a talent drain because people are not able to teach or practice medicine the way they want to. They're not able to perhaps even be pastors and clergy in the way they want to. So I think we have to pay attention to that aspect as well, like who's coming in, who's leaving, not just over the US border, but over the Texas border.
Absolutely. And, of course, with the current policies, in the city that I live in, Houston, we often say we're the most religiously and culturally diverse city in the nation, but we were also a hub for receiving and resettling refugees. And that's, being dramatically impacted along with some of the assaults on, Catholic charities, it will be very interesting to see how that shapes Texas going forward and the fabric. So let me just kind of close on this note, and then maybe we can take some questions. And you can just jump in whatever order you want to answer this, but what would you say are the biggest challenges to telling the story of Texas as it relates to religion and migration? So if you could talk to journalists, what would you say are the biggest challenges, or what would you like to see journalists pay more attention to? Hey, you are a journalist, but so you don't have to answer that.
I would have an answer.
Please answer. Go ahead.
Okay, happy to go first. Yeah, I think a challenge we're facing, so I guess one thing that I cover is the challenge of Catholic institutions to keep up with or change appropriately to confront the fact that, or not confront sounds very aggressive, but to include Latinos who are becoming a much bigger part of the church. So 36% of Catholic adults are Latino, but 60% of Catholics under 18 are Latino. And we're seeing that, demographic shift broadly in the US and then specifically here in Texas. Since 2022, there are more Hispanics than non-Hispanic white people. And so the way we do journalism has to change, just like Catholic institutions have to change. And the reality is right now in religion reporting, Latino faith stories aren't getting the frequency, the accuracy, the nuance that they deserve. It's not happening. And I think it's a problem that needs to be solved multiple ways. Some of it is just like patterns of doing things have to change. Relationships have to be built. There has to be more space for Latino journalists to be in religion reporting, but also non-Latino journalists have to develop cultural competency, get out there, ask questions, be humble, and also get to know faith communities that aren't used to working with press, who might make faux pas, who might not reach out to you, who might, all types of things that communities that have had more power historically are already good at. So I think it's a big challenge, and I think we got to keep working on it.
I frequent a mega church that in San Antonio, that numbers now 25,000 people and turned away 9,000 people last week. And that church is led, right now, the main campus is led by 2 young Black men worship leaders who lead the congregation in English and Spanish songs. It's prodigiously interracial, multiracial, both on the platform and the pews. Linguistically, it's trying things that I haven't seen done before. And impressively, it is very cross-class. You can see people who are clearly very upper class, and you can see people who are clearly very lower class. And I don't think that these stories show up very well. This is a non-denominational church now, so it's like already not part of denominational storytelling. It's also just hard to get at when, we see the disaggregation of how these people show up at the polls. Here's how Latino Protestants vote. Here's how white Protestants vote. Here's how Black Protestants vote. When you're talking about a congregation of 25,000 with pretty strong cross-representation, I don't know how they're showing up at the polls, and I don't know that their votes can be disaggregated that way and still tell a coherent religious story about Texas. And that is just one of 6 such mega churches in a 15-mile radius in San Antonio. So I think Texan religion is really complex, and this is the kind of storyline I think is shaping Texas public life, including politics, but just hard to get at.
Thanks. I think that we need to tell the story of how diverse the immigrants, the religiosity of the immigrants that are crossing the southern border. So there are Haitians, right, that come from different religious backgrounds. There are people from all over Latin America. There are people who speak Arabic. There are people who speak Chinese. So the diversity of the people crossing the southern border for a long time now has been increasing. And so that's something that I think needs to be paid attention to. The other thing that I think really needs attention is the fact that the border doesn't just exist at the southern border. It exists in the detention centers in Hutto, in Dilley, and in other places, because these are the tentacles, the extensions of the militarized border, which is not just at the southern border, right? It's these detention centers which are now being used for political repression. So we have to be mindful that this system that attacks immigrants in Texas is now being used across the board to attack people who are dissenting. So this is an important part of us that our analysis has to be rooted in what we're thinking about how it impacts Texas, but it's not separate from what is happening beyond and outside our imaginary borders. And whether that be in Gaza or whether that be in Boston where students have been taken. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And the other thing I think is just centering the spirituality of the immigrants. A lot of the immigrants, and I know I don't want to be simplistic about it when we look at the history and the research, but a lot of communities in Latin America are recipients of, I study missions, right? The history of Christian missions, of Euro-American missions that centered US imperialism, especially during the Cold War. Yeah. And so this was intentional and also accidental. And including CIA agents who said that they were missionaries in order to spread US propaganda. Okay, so it isn't a coincidence then that a lot of Christians in different places in Latin America have adopted US exceptionalist, Christian nationalist narratives. And so the relationship between what happens in Texas is reciprocal and circular between Latin America and between Texas. So that's also something to keep in mind. And all of those things are rooted in whiteness and commitments to the ideas that the US is exceptional.
So I'll just come right back to the Seder where I started. And right after you read that passage about this is the bread of affliction, we ask 4 questions. And I think cultivating that spirit of inquiry, that dedication to asking questions, that is at the heart of journalism. And then asking the questions that allow us to tell the stories that help us feel connected to each other, to belong to each other, to be a lot less concerned with exceptionalism than we are with feeling rooted, connected, and that is where real safety comes in, not because our border is militarized and has a lot of concertina wire and all of it. It comes from being curious about each other and being willing to answer other people's questions when they have questions about us. We can't expect them to know about us because nobody's telling our story anymore, right? And people aren't reading about our stories, and those books are getting banned. So it's even more incumbent on us now to be asking a lot of questions, and then as Robbie does in his work, and then sharing the results on a broad scale, but the one-on-one, on the ground, getting into those communities, overcoming some fear and discomfort so that we can hear stories and tell them authentically. I think that's where our hope lies for Texas, and hopefully that can also be spread.
I think we're going to move to questions now.
Absolutely, and we have a couple here, but I just encourage those joining us here in person. I know I sound like a broken record, but just really do welcome your questions, wherever those questions are coming from, so that the panel can kind of wrestle with them together. It's at texastribune.org/ask. I want to start here because part of, I think, the premise we're working from, and I think we heard it from Aleja as well, that there's good journalism being done, there's not enough of it happening. If journalism isn't providing the storytelling needed to raise awareness, are there, I guess, two questions. Are there other vehicles, other models beyond journalism that are doing that right now, whether it be art or whatever else that may be? And are there some of those vehicles that we should be leaning into more for that storytelling?
I think there are a lot of places where that happens, and I think for, the fact that, first of all, I'm really, really grateful that the Texas Tribune exists and that they are part of, and a big part of, starting independent journalism that is, nonprofit and really tells stories without being beholden to other groups. I mean, I suggested that the Dallas Morning News people come and listen to this. Maybe they're listening online. I don't know, but I think that to have journalism connect with things like this, symposia, the Tribune Fest in Austin, giving people opportunities to engage in other ways in conversation with journalism is fantastic, and definitely something I appreciate about what you do and hope you continue to do.
So part of what Aleja raised is that if engaging and working with faith communities that may not be used to working with the press. I'm wondering if you can give some details about what does that lack of trust, how does that play out, but what can some of that work look like? Because I feel like that needs to be deeply intentional and it takes considerable amount of time too.
Yeah, that's so real. I think one of the challenges journalists are facing today is that a lot of us are being asked to do a whole lot of things in so little time. And that really, as a structure, falls heavily on not doing as well at covering communities that historically haven't been covered or have fewer resources. I think one way I approach news sources in general, but especially sources who might kind of come with that background, is in the introduction saying, if you have any questions about RNS or my article, please ask. I start out by sitting down, and sometimes depending on the interview, I'll say, what do you feel like journalists get wrong about this topic, this community, or is there anything you're concerned I'm gonna miss? And being like very willing to be in the listening position for people who feel like they haven't gotten a fair shake before. But I think it's also like we have all these norms about how journalism operates, and when I'm interacting with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, we operate along those norms because they have comms people and they know how it works. There's other, faith leaders who can pay to have a full-time PR agency get their stories in media, and those people, like that's, a complaint I hear is, oh, we see the same 3 Latino evangelical voices in all mainstream media. And I say, well, they've got a paid PR person who is getting in people's inboxes when major things happen. And so it takes intentionality on the part of the journalist to find time and reach out to people who haven't, had those platforms, but also patience when this person might be making requests that are inappropriate with journalistic norms, who might be asking to see a story before it's published, or might be more likely to, all types of things that, and I guess I could think of more, because I've had all sorts of things happen, and I think it's having the patience to sit down and call the source and explain, this is why we don't do things that way. These are the values we're trying to uphold. Your feedback is important to me. Our relationship is important. But this is why things work this way. And also, the other thing is for like white Catholics, my inbox is full of story tips. Latino Catholics, that's the way it is. And they'll have great things going on. And I have to call sources up and keep a calendar and say, check back in September when they said this thing was going to happen, because they will not send me an email. I'm not going to get, they're not in the habit. It's the relationship hasn't been built, that the things are not kind of set up to happen that way. And hopefully through the relationship, maybe things will change, but it is extra effort. It's probably a long answer, but a lot I've been thinking about there.
Let's see. Mara asks, can someone speak about current missions practices from US-based churches to other countries and how those practices are complicating the conversation on migration?
Okay, I'll take that question. I mean, I think here's the thing, is that Christian churches are amazing at charity. And we tend, I'm being critical of myself here, my denomination, progressive denomination, for example, but it's not the only one, but we're not good at solidarity. So we go to places and we assume what people need, and we do things, we feel sorry, and we drop material goods, and we do not maintain a relationship. And so this is a huge problem with missions, both foreign and domestic missions, and this complicates it. Another complicating thing is that you will have many Christian churches of a wide variety of theological and political persuasions that will say, do not let them in, come the right way, but will gleefully go and spend their resources to go somewhere else and not learn anything about why those people are coming here, because their economies and their governments have completely been toppled by our economy that thrives off of the ruin of their economy. So there is the failed sort of historical and political analysis that churches don't do when they visit places to recognize our role in forcing people to migrate from their homes. They don't want to leave. So I think those are things that complicate it, and that make it more complicated, and where we continue to participate in these systems because we don't do the analysis that is required of us and that should be required of us.
That's an interesting question from Ava. Given the public criticism and denouncing of faith-based organizations or even international humanitarian aid, is there a possibility or evidence to support a future development of secular aid and or unaffiliated domestic humanitarian aid in the U.S.?
That's also under attack now. I mean, it's not, they're not discriminating.
I think what's going on, it's not that faith-based groups are being attacked because they're faith-based. It's that it's surprising that groups that have had a long history of often cordial relationships with previous Republican administrations and politicians are now coming kind of under attack for the work generally. So it's the category of work that is being targeted. But I think faith leaders are finding it surprising that they, might have had decades of working successfully or at least cordially with Republican politicians, and that's not happening right now.
And specifically with, if you look at resettlement, in the first Trump administration, they reduced the number of federal recipients of aid for resettlement to 7. The biggest one was Catholic Charities. So Catholic Charities was getting, when Trump came in this time, was getting more money than anyone else to resettle. So now they're also being attacked by, the executive branch, the legal forces of the executive branch.
I hate to bring up my colleague Jack again, but I was going down to the border to write this profile about Sister Norma Pimentel and her relationship with Bishop Daniel Flores and how they work together. I think it's kind of an undercovered thing that you have two huge Catholic leaders, right, both in the Diocese of Brownsville. But he had done an early profile about Sister Norma kind of before she blew up, and I think the public politicians who were down there, like Ted Cruz was down there praising Sister Norma. And so he was telling me, he was like, things have changed so much and it's only been, what, a decade? Yeah.
So I have a really big question here, just prepping you for it. George from Dallas asks, do you think there is a theology of migration? And if so, could you tease that out?
That's a big one.
No, that's really great because I was listening to you talk about what I'm increasingly thinking of Christian internationalism, which seems like a doctrine that if it's motivated by Christianity or Christian commitments or some similar, maybe Jewish liberationist commitments, that activity should be allowed, not disallowed. And if it's disallowed, it's being attacked. It makes ready sense to me that would be a religious freedom claim, but also that it would be bounded by territory. So essentially, I do think there is operative in this conversation an emergent Christian internationalism that takes itself for granted as good religion that doesn't have to give an account of itself and its limits vis-a-vis democracy. But it will have to say that it's changed. It has changed, then the legal groundwork will prove that out. And it will have reshaping powers over even, for instance, Catholic imagination around what it can offer to migrants. And I think some of this comes down to democratic force by the numbers of people who actually show up to the polls and put different administrations in place. But yes, I do think there is a theology operative here. It just sounds so progressive. It sounds like it's just good logic. But the very fact that it's Christian operatives that are needing to claim religious freedom illustrates that it is a de facto Christian exercise, or it's like a religious, it's a theology of migration and reception that is attempting to set itself as policy norm through a moral claim that is going to have some work to do. And I don't think it gets enunciated as such.
I think that's where we'll leave it. Thank our panel so much for their conversation.